Welcome back to Philosophy of Mind. We've been considering altered states of consciousness, and one way to think about how they're structured is to think about them on a continuum of reality. On the one end, we have perception, which is reality, and on the other hand, we have hallucination. And the question is, what is hallucination in terms of reality? So starting with perception, what we know of as reality, we can think about items on this reality continuum in terms of sensory representations. Remember, a representation is an aboutness, so I have sensory states that are about something, about states of affairs. States of affairs is just a fancy philosophy way of talking about all the different items that are happening at a given time. So a state of affairs is just a collection of affairs, a collection of events that are happening. So sensory representations of states of affairs, if it's perception, my sensory representation of states of affairs appear as they are at the time of representation. So my perceptions right now, my sensory representations are of the state of affairs that is this room that I'm in. So I'm seeing things, I'm hearing things, I'm having thoughts. These are the perceptions that I'm having at this time. And that is representing the things that are going on at this time. So that's what perception is, and I'm perceiving reality. So when we were talking about veridical perception, that means veritas. Veridical is of reality, are truthful representations. So perceptions are about reality. A little further towards hallucinations on the reality continuum are imagery. When I'm imagining things, I have sensory representations of states of affairs that do not exist at the time of representation, but are voluntarily produced. So images are things that I'm imagining. They're not occurring right now, but they are voluntary. I know that they are not happening right now, and I'm producing them. So I can imagine a pink elephant sitting here on the desk, and I can imagine it in all kinds of detail. Maybe, I'm not sure how good my perception is, or my imagination is in terms of my detail. But I can imagine and I can control my imagination. So that's the second stage towards hallucination. The third stage towards hallucination is a pseudo-hallucination, and this is where the sensory representations do not exist at the time of representation and are not voluntarily produced, but they're recognized as illusory. And pseudo-hallucination is a very wide range of hallucinations that you might have. So dreams are not recognized as hallucinatory while you're having them, but when you wake up, then you recognize that you were in a dream state. Maybe all kinds of other sorts of hallucinations fall into this category. So they're hallucinations. When I'm hallucinating, the pink elephant here is not controlled by me. I didn't produce it. It's not occurring right now. There is no pink elephant here, but I recognize that there's no pink elephant here, and so that makes it a pseudo-hallucination. And then on the far end of the reality continuum is hallucination. And these are sensory representations of states of affairs that do not exist at the time of representation, are not voluntarily produced, and are not recognized as illusory. So to be a full-on hallucination, I'm seeing this pink elephant right here, I didn't produce it, and I don't realize that it is a hallucination. So I think it's real. I think that what I'm experiencing is real. So dreams before you wake up, if in fact the simulation view is correct and you're having the dream experience, my experience of dreaming is that I don't recognize that it's a hallucination. I don't realize that I'm dreaming. I feel like I'm in the dream. I feel like the dream is here and now, and that what I'm experiencing is the world. And then when I wake up, I realize that it was hallucination. So hallucinations, you don't realize what's going on. What produces the hallucinations? various different ways in which hallucinations come about. They can come about by mental illness. Schizophrenia, epileptic seizure, and dementia are some of the forms of mental illness that produce hallucinations, and there are various different kinds of explanations, physiological and psychotic, in terms of thinking about what produces those hallucinations. And that's one of the areas of treatment, is to think about that relationship, that intersection of psychosis, the mental breakdown, with the physiological causes in mental illness. Another kind of cause of hallucinations is sensory deprivations. So Charles Bonnet syndrome is a case where it's a kind of blindness that you lose your input, your visual input, and you start producing hallucinations as a result of that particular loss of visual input. And degradation of vision, which is a degradation of vision and hearing, can also cause different kinds of hallucinations. And so some of our SAC stories have talked about that, and we'll talk about the ways in which sensory deprivation causes kinds of hallucinations. Rituals cause hallucinations. So the picture here is of whirling dervishes, and they spin around in ritual dances to produce trance-like states, which are a kind of hallucination. And other kinds of rituals will produce hallucinations. Sleep deprivation will produce hallucinations. So if you don't sleep, if you go through your exams and you're just in such stress that you don't sleep for days on end, you will start hallucinating. So I do not recommend that is your response to being behind during final exam period. You should get proper sleep, because that keeps your brain functioning. All right, but if you don't, then you'll start to hallucinate after a certain period of time. And then drugs. We'll talk about drug-induced hallucinations later, and what kinds of drugs produce what kinds of hallucinations, and how those change your sense of your body awareness. Also, in terms of thinking about hallucinations, there are common features that Sachs talks about. So there are bright colors, circular forms, symmetrical shapes, and form constants. I'll talk about form constants a little bit more in a minute. But what's interesting is to think about the ways in which these common features of hallucinations are related to the structure of our visual system, and they're related to the structure of our brain system and our neurotransmitters, again, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. So thinking about how we think of our consciousness as entirely unique, and you might think of your hallucinations in certain contexts as taking you to an alternate reality. And so think about these common features of hallucinations in relation to those ways of thinking. How unique are your experiences if people all experience the same features? If people all experience the same features, is that more or less an indication that you're going to an alternate reality? You can interpret in a couple of different ways. So again, be thinking about what these different altered states, in particular hallucinations, tell us about consciousness and the relationship of brains to consciousness. Form constants, as I mentioned, come in various structures. So they're forms that are constant and arguably produced by the structure of the visual system. So when you're hallucinating because you have sensory deprivation or for some other reason, then your visual system is being activated in a way that it was designed to do in terms of perception, but is being activated without that perceptual input. And so it's still operating according to its functional structure, and these are the four sorts of structures that tend to appear in hallucinations. So gratings and lattices, tunnels, funnels and cones, spirals, cobwebs. The picture here exemplifies more of the spirally, cobwebby aspect of it. There are other pictures that demonstrate more of the lattices, that you're, like ladders and so forth, or tunnels, as with near-death experiences going through a tunnel. So these are common sorts of structures that you have in your hallucinations. As you're thinking about hallucinations, recall the 4 categories of phenospace and be thinking about, for each sort of hallucination and each sort of drug effect, what is the effect of these, on your phenospace in these different categories. So attention, global focused, inward, outward, memory, how is thinking affected, how is emotion, how is time perception affected, is the arousal high or low, is perception veridical or hallucinatory, or does it seem like it's veridical, does it seem like it's hallucinatory, what's the body sense, and what is the control that you have when you're in these various different altered states. As we go through the different drugs and thinking about altered states and how different drugs generate hallucinations and other kinds of altered states, think about these aspects of phenospace. This is another map of phenospace that connects phenomenology to the neurotransmitters that we'll be talking about in a minute. And so you can kind of look at the ways in which arousal and the reality continuum figure in this kind of graph, and some of the drugs that we'll be talking about and how they connect with, with altered states of consciousness.